Welcome to another part of the ISM Exercise Set Microeconomics, this time with a unit on welfare and taxation. Let's have a look at the exercise. We have considered the following supply and demand curves. So we have supply and demand, and then we have the following tasks to be performed. First, calculate the market equilibrium, then determine the saturation quantity and the prohibition price. C, calculate the consumer and producer surplus. D, a tax of 10 is levied to the companies, implicitly stating as well in which way does this impact the overall equilibrium. Then calculate the effect on the overall economic welfare. And that's all we have to do, all those 5 parts. And well, we'll start by working our way through this one by one. So we start with the easiest, the market equilibrium. For this we just equalize demand and supply. And then we solve this for the quantity x. So we go plus 8x plus 2, giving us 10x being equal to 30. We divide by 10, giving us here a result, an equilibrium quantity of 3. This can then be inserted again into either demand or supply curve. Here we do this with the supply curve because it's a bit easier. And we get an equilibrium price of 2 times 3 minus 2, so an equilibrium price of 4. Then we have equilibrium price and quantity. And that's all there is to part A. So we can continue with part B, where it's about the prohibition price and the saturation quantity. And they are more or less similar. Which way are they similar? Well, the prohibition price, that's the price which is so high that no one wants to buy the good anymore. So that's where the quantity drops to 0. So in other words, that's the the intersection of the demand curve with the p-axis, with the price axis. On the other hand, the saturation quantity, that's a quantity which is consumed if the price drops to 0. So that's the intersection of the demand curve with the quantity axis, with the x-axis here. In other words, for the prohibition price to be calculated, we just insert Q, or the quantity, the x being equal to 0, into the demand curve. Then we get here a prohibition price of 28. As I said, that's the p-intercept of the demand curve. Then for the saturation quantity, we do it the other way around. We insert a price of 0 into the demand curve, giving us here an x of 3.5. Thereby we have a saturation quantity of 3.5. And this is the x-intercept of the demand curve. And with this, we already have most of what we need for the part C as well. The part C, it's about welfare effects of the equilibrium. So consumer surplus, producer surplus, and overall welfare. And the consumer surplus, that's the advantage the consumers have from the market equilibrium being as it is. So what we can do here is basically calculate the area between equilibrium price and demand curve, only up to the quantity which is actually consumed, so only up to the point where we reach the equilibrium. And well, that's pretty easily done because that's just the area of a triangle where one side is the demand curve, the other side is the equilibrium price, and the third side is the p-axis. And if we do this from a calculation point of view, it's simply prohibition price minus equilibrium price, all this into parentheses, times equilibrium quantity, and as this is a triangle, divided by 2. And then this looks as follows. It's like prohibition price 28 minus equilibrium price 4 in parentheses times equilibrium quantity 3 and times 1/2 or divided by 2, giving us here a consumer surplus of 36. Similarly, for the producer surplus, we calculate the area between the equilibrium price and the supply curve up to the point of the equilibrium. So here, well, we need to have the height between the intercept of the supply curve with the price axis and the equilibrium price. Problem is, the first one we didn't yet calculate. So how can we get this? Well, similarly to the prohibition price, we simply insert Q being equal to 0 into the supply curve. This will give us here a value of -2. So we calculate here equilibrium price minus -2, the intersection of the supply curve with the price axis, and we multiply all of this with 3. That's the equilibrium quantity. Here we can state that, well, if we do it like this, this implicitly means that there are actually some suppliers which even supply the good if the price becomes negative. Well, we keep to this because that's like the theoretical way to work with this function, but in reality we would highly question this, whether producers like this actually exist. Okay, but if we keep it as is, we get here a producer surplus of 9. Now we can add consumer and producer surplus, giving us an overall welfare of 45. So we have 45 as overall welfare. And well, that summarizes how any of the two parties, customers or companies, profit from the market equilibrium, from the market price in particular. Then we can take a look, next part, how this is impacted by the introduction of a tax. So if we introduce a tax, this has an impact on the supply curve, because as we said in the task, the tax is levied on the companies, the suppliers. This means, well, if the tax is 10 units, the supply curve will shift upwards by 10 units. We can easily implement this, but for this, first we have to have a supply curve which reads as P being equal to. Because as soon as we have this, we can just add 10, because the taxes increase the price by 10 units. But as I said, we need to have it as P being equal to. And here we have the advantage, it already reads as P being equal to. So we simply can add the 10 units, giving us a new intercept of 8. So, well, we have the new intercept, we have the new supply curve. So we can use the new supply curve to also get a new equilibrium. So we again equalize demand and supply, so new supply and old demand curve. Solve this for x again, so go again with plus 8x minus 8, giving us here 10x equal to 20, divided by 10 gives us new equilibrium quantity of 2. We insert this again into one of the two equations. So here we insert this in supply and get a new equilibrium price of 12. So we have our new equilibrium. We have the new intercept of the supply curve with the price axis. That's the 8. So we just substitute these three values in the calculations for consumer and producer surplus, which we had on the slide before. That's then already part of part D, the welfare effects of the tax. So here, well, for the consumer surplus, the prohibition price, this one stays the same because this depends on the situation of the demand curve. Demand curve here is not impacted by the tax, so prohibition price stays at 28 minus, then we have the new equilibrium price of 12 and the new quantity is changed to 2. So if we recalculate consumer surplus, we get a new consumer surplus of 16. Then we can do the same thing for the producer surplus. Here, equilibrium price, the 12, minus the new intersect of the supply curve with the p-axis, that's the 8. That's what I just pointed out in the last slide. Then times the equilibrium quantity of 2, giving a new production surplus, producer surplus of 4. If we add both of them up, we get a new welfare of 20. Okay, that's how much consumers and producers are impacted by the tax. However, with the introduction of the tax, a new player entered the market as well, and that's the government. The government gets the tax revenue. The tax revenue, that's just the height of the tax times the quantity of what is taxed, so times the equilibrium quantity. So here we have 10, that's the tax rate, times 2, that's the equilibrium quantity, resulting in a tax revenue of 20 as well. So consumers and producers have a welfare of 20, government has an income of 20 via the taxes. But what about the rest? Because if we recall, it was a bit higher than 40, what we had in the welfare before. This was the part C. And this is, well, the difference, this is what we call the so-called welfare loss of the introduction of the tax. And we get this by subtracting from the old welfare, the W, the new welfare, and the tax revenue. So that's the part of the old welfare which is lost, which neither, after the introduction of the tax, the consumers, the producers, or the government gets. And here, that's a loss of 5. So what does the 5 actually mean? Well, it's pretty hard to make sense of the absolute number, but if we switch to relative effects, meaning we can just calculate the change in consumers producer surplus, we see that both of them decrease by 55.555%. That's just the growth rate of old consumer surplus, new consumer surplus, old producer surplus, new producer surplus. And the actual advantage of calculating these relative effects is a totally different one, because this allows us to check whether our calculations up to this point are correct. Because we will get the same decrease for consumer surplus and for producer surplus. So if we calculate both and they are not the same, we must have made a mistake somewhere in all of our calculations. Well, that's a neat way to check whether we actually did this exercise correctly. And well, that's also already everything I wanted to tell you in the course of this exercise. So I hope you enjoyed listening to it. And if you're looking for additional exercises, feel free to visit the rest of the exercise set or have a look in the corresponding playlist. I say goodbye and see you next time.